They say a man's home is his castle. But out here, on my open ranch where the air smells like pine and freedom, even the simplest things become a battleground. You'd think a mailbox, just a post with a metal box on it, would be safe from drama. But when the HOA got involved, that little box turned into a war zone. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. I came out in the morning, coffee in hand, and saw my mailbox knocked over, lying face down in the dirt like it got into a bar fight and lost. Tire tracks in the gravel shoulder. I thought maybe it was a delivery truck or some bored teenagers. Annoying? Sure, but fixable. I picked it up, hammered the post back in, and went about my day. Didn't give it another thought until it happened again. And again. Same time, same spot, same clean tire tracks leading away like whoever did it didn't even bother to slow down. I asked my neighbor if he'd seen anything. He just shook his head and mumbled something about those HOA enforcers thinking they run the whole town. HOA enforcers. That's what we called them. They weren't real cops. Just a bunch of wannabe officers wearing reflective vests and clipboards, pretending like barking orders about hedge height or driveway stains made them authority figures. And apparently, they'd taken a special interest in my mailbox. Maybe because it sat just outside their so-called jurisdiction line. Maybe because they didn't like the American flag I had painted on the side. Or maybe they were just bored. So I did what any rational person would do. I replaced it again, this time with a bigger post. I figured if the last one broke, maybe a sturdier one will hold up. But 2 days later, I found that one in splinters too. This wasn't random. This was targeted. At this point, I started keeping track. I installed a cheap trail cam on a tree across the road, hidden in the bark, barely noticeable. I didn't want confrontation, just proof. And sure enough, after 4 days, I caught them. 2 men in a white pickup with an HOA logo on the door, driving up slow, pretending to inspect something, then veering right into the mailbox like it was part of their route. I watched that clip 5 times before I said a word. They didn't even flinch. Just crushed the box like it was cardboard, then kept driving like it was a job well done. That's when the anger set in. Not the yelling, door-slamming kind of anger. The cold, calculated kind. The kind that makes you stop, sit down, and start planning. Because, see, this wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about respect. About being pushed around by people who think rules don't apply when they're the ones enforcing them. It was about someone thinking they could roll over what's mine and laugh about it later. I thought about reporting it to sheriff. But let's be honest, around here, if you say HOA, most people just roll their eyes and move on. And besides, I didn't want someone else fixing my problem. I wanted to fix it myself. The right way. My way. So I started sketching out ideas. What could I build that looked like a mailbox, but wasn't just a victim waiting to happen? What could take a hit and hit back without anyone realizing until it was too late? I wasn't looking for revenge exactly. I just wanted the next driver to think twice, maybe even 3 times. And in the back of my mind, I could already hear the satisfying crunch of bumper on steel. Not that I'd wish damage on anyone, but if they chose to run it over again, they wouldn't forget it. Not this time. I cleared out space in the shed, pulled out some tools, and dusted off a few blueprints I'd been saving for a rainy day. This wasn't going to be an ordinary mailbox anymore. This was going to be a statement. A quiet one. One that didn't shout, but whispered something they'd never forget. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about how easy it was for them to wreck something that wasn't theirs, like it meant nothing. The mailbox itself wasn't expensive. It was about $30, and the post maybe 10 more. But it wasn't about money anymore. It was the principle. Out here, on a ranch where most days are peaceful and quiet, disrespect shows up loud and clear. The next morning, I looked over footage again. I noticed something. The truck never slowed down when they hit the mailbox. They didn't even try to swerve. That means it wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. And they weren't worried about being caught. That stung more than the busted wood and crumpled metal. They were sure I wouldn't do anything. Well, that was about to change. I spent the rest of the morning making calls. I wasn't in the HOA. I'd already seen how that worked out. Instead, I spoke to a few old buddies, guys who'd spent time in trades, construction, even one who used design parts for off-road rigs. I asked questions. I kept it casual. Hypothetically, I'd say, what kind of post would survive a hit from a pickup doing about 15 miles per hour? The answers came back faster than I expected. Concrete, steel core, deep foundation, reinforced casing. One guy even laughed and said, "Sounds like you're building a mailbox with armor." I just smiled and said, "Maybe I am." That same afternoon, I drove out to the nearest salvage yard. I found a steel pipe, thick, heavy, about 6 feet long. It weighed nearly 80 pounds. Just hauling it into the bed of my truck made my back ache. But the moment I saw it, I knew it was perfect. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream trap. It was just solid, unshakable. Exactly what I needed. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and picked up a welded steel box. It was technically a mailbox, but built like a safe. No flimsy hinges, no thin tin that rattles in the wind. Just solid gauge metal, coated black, simple and strong. It didn't look like much, but that was part of the plan. Back at the ranch, I set up in the shed. I spent the whole evening working in silence, just me and the tools. Welded the base of the box to the pipe, drilled holes for mounting, filled the bottom 2 feet of the pipe with concrete, so it wouldn't budge, even if a truck rammed it at full speed. It wasn't about causing harm. I wasn't booby-trapping anything. I just wanted something that could take a hit and stand tall afterward, something that could send a message without saying a word. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at it. It didn't look like a threat. It looked like a normal mailbox. But underneath, it was a pillar, a post meant to outlast whatever they threw at it. And it felt good, not angry, just right. The next challenge was installing it without drawing attention. The HOA guys usually made their rounds midweek in the afternoon, so I picked a Sunday morning before dawn. Still dark, no one around. I loaded the new mailbox into the truck and drove to the edge of my property, just where the gravel road meets the highway. Digging the hole wasn't easy. I had to go deep, 3 feet at least, and mix fresh concrete right there on the spot. I worked with gloves and a red flashlight, moving quiet, steady. By the time the sun peeked over the trees, it was done, buried, set, leveled. From a distance, it looked like any other box on a country road. But if you knew what was underneath, you'd think twice. I cleaned up everything and walked back to the house. I didn't feel revengeful. I didn't feel nervous. I felt calm, because now it was out of my hands. They'd either pass by and ignore it, or they'd try again. And if they did, well, I had a feeling things wouldn't go quite the way they expected. By the time Monday rolled around, I had the trail cam repositioned just right, aimed directly at the new mailbox. It was tucked behind a patch of wild sage, barely visible unless you knew it was there. I wasn't going to sit on the porch with binoculars or wait in my truck. I wasn't out for a showdown. I just wanted to watch what happened next without saying a word. It was strange, that feeling, a mix of nerves and quiet satisfaction, like watching a storm roll and that you already built a shelter for. You don't want to damage, but if it comes, you know you're ready. That morning, everything was still. The wind barely moved the grass. Even the cattle were calm, gathered by the fence like they sensed something was different. By early afternoon, I was back inside the house, pretending to stay busy. But every time I heard a truck pass by on the gravel road, my ears perked up. There's a sound you get used to when you live out here. Ranchers drive different than city folks. Slower, more deliberate. But that HOA pickup, I knew its tone like a bad song stuck in your head. Slight rattle in the engine. Tires just a little underinflated. Always a little too fast, like they had something to prove. At 2:41 p.m., that sound came rumbling down the road. I didn't run to the window. I just sat at the table, fingers on my coffee mug, listening. A slight slowdown. Then the engine roared a little. A quick thump. A grunt from metal. Then silence. Not the kind that says nothing happened. The kind that feels like something just went wrong. A silence too heavy to ignore. I waited a few more minutes before walking out to check. From a distance, I could already see something was off. The mailbox was still standing, perfectly upright, no scratches, no dents. But 10 feet down the road, the HOA truck was stopped with the hazard lights blinking. The driver's side door was open, and one of the men was pacing back and forth, hands on his head. The other one stood near the front bumper, bent down, looking underneath. I stayed back far enough not to be seen, just behind the tool shed. Watched for a few minutes while they talked. One of them kicked the dirt, clearly frustrated. Then, without much more debate, they climbed back into the truck, slammed the doors, and drove off, slower this time. Much slower. Later, I checked the trail cam footage. It was all there. They approached the mailbox like usual, no intention of stopping. They even nudged the wheel slightly like they meant to run it over. Again. But this time, the moment the front bumper hit the steel-reinforced post, the truck shuddered. You could see it clear as day. The hood bounced up slightly, and the entire front end jolted back like it hit a concrete wall. The mailbox didn't even wiggle. Not an inch. Their expressions were priceless. Shock, confusion, a little fear, like someone who poked a sleeping dog and realized it had teeth. And right there in the middle of the road, they discovered that this wasn't the same old game anymore. That mailbox wasn't just decoration. It was a line in the sand. I didn't smile watching it. I wasn't happy to see them suffer. But I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Not because they'd been punished, but because the cycle had broken. I didn't have to yell or argue or file complaints. I didn't have to beg anyone to respect my property. I just made it so they couldn't ignore it anymore. Later that evening, I noticed something strange. For the first time in weeks, the HOA truck didn't do its usual loop. No slow cruise down my road. No unnecessary stops. No surveillance pretending to be inspections. Just quiet. It was as if, all of a sudden, they found somewhere else to focus their energy. The next day, I checked the mailbox again. Still flawless. Still standing. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to keep replacing anything. I felt like I'd earned my ground back, one bolt and weld at a time. A few days passed, and things got oddly quiet. Almost too quiet. No more tire marks near the mailbox. No more broken posts, scattered nails, or dented metal. The mailbox just stood there like a statue, calm, solid, and untouched. And while part of me wanted to believe it was over, another part knew better. HOA folks don't like losing, especially not to someone they think they can control. Wednesday afternoon, I got an email from the HOA board. It was short, cold, and full of fake politeness. They wanted to inquire about a potentially non-standard mailbox installation on my property. Funny, they never care about standards when my mailbox was getting crushed every other week. But now that it stood its ground, suddenly it was a problem. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to see how far they'd push it. That Friday, a notice appeared taped to my gate. No envelope, just flapping in the wind like a warning flag. They claimed my mailbox could be a hazard to vehicles, and that I had 72 hours to remove or replace it or face fines. I took the paper down, folded it neatly, and slid it into my jacket pocket. Then I grabbed my phone and started recording. Not for YouTube, not for drama, just for protection. I filmed the mailbox from every angle, showed that it wasn't on the road, wasn't blocking anything, and was well within my property line. It didn't lean into the street. It didn't have spikes or blades or anything dangerous. It was just sturdy, and apparently that was enough to scare them. That night, I reviewed county regulations, page after page of dry legal text. But buried in there was exactly what I needed. As long as the mailbox didn't obstruct traffic, violate height limits, or pose a risk to public safety, it was legal. Nowhere did it say I had to use flimsy materials or that I had to brake when hit. So the next morning, I sent them a reply. Simple, respectful, and backed with legal references. I attached photos, timestamps, and quoted their own HOA guidelines, ones they clearly hadn't read lately. I told them I was happy to comply with real safety standards, but I wouldn't be replacing something that followed every rule just because it made someone uncomfortable. No answer came back. Not that day, not the next. But on Monday I saw something strange. A new truck pulled onto my road. Not the usual HOA pickup. This one was shinier, newer, and had a logo from the main office. Higher up the food chain, a man in khakis and a blazer stepped out, clipboard in hand, walking slowly toward the mailbox. He didn't touch it, didn't measure it, just circled it like he was trying to find something wrong. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching. Eventually, he noticed me and waved. I nodded back but didn't move. He hesitated, then walked toward the house and introduced himself as a compliance officer. I invited him to speak right there, no need to come inside. He asked a few questions, all very polite. Where I got the mailbox, what it was made of, whether I was aware of the complaints. I told him everything honestly. I explained the damage, the videos, the repeated harassment, and the fact that this was the first time anyone from the HOA ever asked what I had experienced. He nodded through most of it, taking notes but saying very little. When I finished, he looked at the mailbox again and said, "I don't see any violations here." That was it. He shook my hand, climbed back in his truck, and drove off. No threats, no warnings, just quiet. But something about that visit seemed to ripple through the HOA. Their truck didn't come back that week. No more emails, no more notices, just silence. And after weeks of stress, it finally felt like the storm had passed. Word must have spread. Neighbors started stopping by, asking about the mailbox like it was a legend. Some laughed. Others looked impressed. A few asked where they could get one just like it. Turns out, I wasn't the only one tired of being pushed around. All it took was one solid post in the ground for people to realize they weren't alone. A week later, I found myself standing at the edge of my driveway, just staring at that mailbox. Funny how something so small could cause so much noise. But now it's still like a sentry, quiet, strong, and finally respected. I hadn't seen the HOA truck in days. Not a single slow crawl past the fence line. No more nosy clipboard guys pretending to jot things down while secretly filming my property. It was like they'd disappeared. But peace, especially when it comes out of nowhere, always makes you a little suspicious. On Wednesday morning, I got another unexpected visit. This time it wasn't from the HOA. It was from a neighbor I barely knew, Tom, from 2 plots down. Retired Army guy. Lived alone, kept himself. He pulled up in a beat-up Bronco, stepped out, and walked over with a grin. "You the guy with the unbreakable mailbox?" he asked, tipping his hat. I just nodded. He chuckled. Heard about it at the feed store. Folks saying the HOA finally met their match. I smiled, but I wasn't exactly interested in gossip. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a photo, his own mailbox, flattened like a soda can. "Third time this month," he said. "And mine ain't even on HOA land. They say it's a visibility issue, but I think they just like throwing their weight around." Turns out, I wasn't the only one targeted. The HOA's cops, as folks sarcastically called them, had been knocking over mailboxes, writing random citations, and making up rules on the fly. Tom said they even fined a family for having a flag too high on their pole. A flag. In rural America. And that's when something clicked. This whole time, I thought I was just unlucky, that they'd pick me out of boredom or spite. But this wasn't personal. It was part of a pattern. They were flexing control. And for most people, it worked. Folks don't want confrontation. They don't want fines or notices or surprise inspections. So they bend. They replace the mailbox. They move the fence. They trim the hedges twice a week just to avoid getting written up. And the HOA loves it. Tom leaned against his truck and said, "You didn't back down." They hate that. Later that day, I got a knock on the door. It was Maggie, the woman who runs a small cafe in town. She lives near the HOA boundary, too. She'd heard about what happened from her cousin, who had heard it from a mechanic who fixed a dent in the HOA truck's front bumper. The story had traveled fast, and with each retelling, it grew legs. People thought I installed a steel trap. Some said it was concrete from a military bunker. Others joked that the mailbox had sensors and could launch pepper spray. None of it was true, of course, but I didn't bother correcting them, because something else was happening now. The story true or exaggerated, was making people stand up a little straighter. Maggie said her husband was building a new post that night. Tom had already poured concrete for his. Another guy down the road had ordered a cast-iron mailbox from out of state. It was like a quiet rebellion had started, and all it took was one man saying enough. By Friday, I counted 7 new mailboxes on our road. Not the flimsy kind, either. Real posts, bolted, reinforced. One even had reflectors, just in case. The message was spreading without a single speech or sign. And the HOA? Still quiet. Not a peep from them, like they sensed something had shifted. That weekend, I drove into town and noticed the mood was different. Lighter. People weren't whispering complaints about the HOA anymore. They were telling stories. Laughing. Some were even planning a community barbecue on land the HOA once claimed wasn't approved for gatherings. No one asked for permission this time. They just decided, like people who remembered they had a say. When I got back home, I parked beside the mailbox and ran my hand across the top. Still cool from the evening breeze. Still solid. Not scratched. Not leaning. Just there, unbothered, like it always should have been. Sunday morning came with a strange calm in the air. The kind that makes you pause a second longer at the window, sipping coffee just to see if anything moves. My mailbox stood right where it had all week, untouched, perfectly upright, still earning respect by simply existing. But as peaceful as things seemed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Around 9 a.m., I heard tires on gravel. Not the usual slow roll of a neighbor or a delivery van. This was different. Sharp turns, quick stops. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw 3 vehicles pulling into the HOA lot down the road. 2 of them were the regular pickups, the ones that patrol like they were on duty. The third was a white SUV with tinted windows and a shiny emblem that definitely wasn't from around here. Whoever this was, they'd come to make a point. I stayed back, arms crossed, watching from a distance. They gathered near the sidewalk, pointing toward the stretch of road where all the new reinforced mailboxes now stood like a line of defiance. One of the men looked down at a clipboard, then up at the boxes, like he was calculating something. 10 minutes later, they split up and started walking door to door. By the time they reached my gate, I already had my phone recording in my pocket, not out of fear, but because experience had taught me they were never just checking in. The man from the SUV did all the talking. Slick hair, polished boots, the kind of guy who looks like he's never dug a hole or changed a tire in his life. He introduced himself as a regional compliance consultant and said he was conducting a review of unsanctioned hardscape modifications, which I assumed was his way of saying, you made something we can't destroy. He asked if I was willing to discuss my structure. I told him it was a mailbox. He gave me a tight smile and said, a rather aggressive one, wouldn't you say? I didn't answer that. He continued, claiming that recent complaints suggested my mailbox and others like it might pose a community risk. When I asked who complained, he deflected. When I asked what exactly the risk was, he cited vehicle damage. I almost laughed. Your trucks cause the damage, I said. Mine just stopped it. He didn't like that. His jaw tightened, and he made a note on his clipboard. Then he handed me a formal notice, again demanding the removal of the mailbox within 48 hours or face escalating fines, including legal action. But this time I was ready. I handed him a folder of my own. Inside, printed regulations from a county road authority, photos of my installation process, timestamps, property boundary markers, and even emails I'd had with local officials who confirmed that everything was above board. I'd done my homework, and I wanted him to know it. He flipped through it in silence, then closed the folder slowly and said, "We'll be in touch." As he walked off, I noticed something. He didn't look confident. Not angry, not smug, just tired, like a man who realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Maybe he expected pushovers. People who would cave the moment a paper with fancy letterhead got waved in their face. But the thing is, once you stand up to intimidation and nothing happens, you stop being afraid of the bark. And clearly, their bite wasn't as strong as it used to be. Later that evening, I got a text from Tom, then another from Maggie. The same consultant had hit their houses too, giving out the same threat. But both of them had the same response: paperwork, proof, and a firm handshake goodbye. And just like that, it wasn't just me fighting back anymore. It was all of us. That night, the street felt different again. Porch lights stayed on a little longer. Conversations carried farther through the open windows. People weren't hiding from HOA threats. They were sharing laughs about them. And in that moment, I realized something big had shifted. This wasn't just about one mailbox anymore. 2 days after the consultant made his rounds, I was up early walking the fence line, checking on the cattle. The sky was a pale gray, just waking up, and the dew clung to every blade of grass like little mirrors. I hadn't even made it back to the porch when I saw something that stopped me cold. The HOA truck was back. Same dent in the bumper, same crooked license plate hanging by one bolt. It was parked on the shoulder near the edge of my property, just sitting there with the engine off. Nobody inside, no one nearby, just idle. I didn't move. I just watched, waiting. Then the driver's door creaked open, and out stepped Marcus, one of the original so-called inspectors who had hit my old mailbox the first time, the one who laughed when it shattered. He didn't have a clipboard this time. No paperwork, just a pair of gloves in his back pocket, and something that looked like a crowbar in his hand. Now, let me be clear, I don't jump to conclusions. But when someone shows up on your land with a tool meant for prying things loose, after being told not to, after weeks of back and forth and official silence, you pay attention. I stayed low behind the barn and watched as he approached the mailbox. No hesitation, no looking around, like he thought no one would stop him, like he believed this was still his road to patrol. He grabbed the edge of the box and gave a yank. Nothing moved. He crouched down and tried to wedge the crowbar underneath. Still nothing. Then he stood back, breathing hard, and looked around like he was expecting someone to clap. I stepped out then. Didn't yell. Didn't run. Just walked across the dirt calmly, boots crunching in the gravel, letting each step speak for itself. Marcus turned, surprised, caught like a kid trying to sneak cookies before dinner. I could tell he wanted to say something, maybe explain, maybe lie, but nothing came out. He just held the crowbar awkwardly, as if suddenly unsure why he had it. I asked him flat out, "You try to fix something that ain't broken?" He didn't answer, so I pointed to the mailbox. "Because from here, looks like you're trying to break something that finally works." He muttered something about just checking stability, but we both knew that was nonsense. He wasn't sent by any office. He came on his own, probably trying to prove something to the rest of the HOA, or maybe just to himself. I told him to leave. He stood there, twitching like he wanted to argue. But then he looked back at the mailbox, still solid, still standing, and walked away without another word. Got into the truck, drove off slower than usual, like all that steam he arrived with had suddenly fizzled out. By noon, the story had already made it to half the neighborhood. Folks were texting, calling, sending screenshots of HOA group chats where board members were scrambling to figure out how to handle recent incidents. Someone even claimed they saw the consultant again, back at the main office, having a heated conversation behind closed doors. Whatever they were planning, it was slipping through their fingers. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. A truck I'd never seen before pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a woman in her 60s, silver hair in a tight ponytail, clipboard in hand, but not like the usual ones. Hers wasn't covered in fines or blank citations. It was a petition. She said her name was Joanne, lived on the other side of the ranch loop. She'd been quiet about things for years, but after hearing what happened with my mailbox and seeing how folks were rallying, she decided enough was enough. "We're not here to make war," she said. "We just want to stop being treated like children." She handed me the paper. Over 20 signatures already on it. People calling for a vote to replace the current HOA board, elect new leadership, and rewrite the rules that have been abused for too long. And this time, they weren't asking. They were organizing. I signed, not because I wanted revenge or drama, but because sometimes doing the right thing starts with standing still, then daring others to stand with you. And suddenly, my mailbox wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a monument to that first line drawn in the dust. 2 days after I signed that petition, the mood in our neighborhood had completely shifted. The whispers were gone. People weren't walking with their heads down anymore. Even the way folks waved from their porches felt different, like we weren't just neighbors now. We were on the same team. The air felt lighter, like someone had finally opened a window in a stale room. That week, every night after dinner, I noticed more porch lights stayed on later. People gathered in driveways and leaned over fences, sharing updates, passing around copies of petition, and comparing stories of what the HOA had done to them. And man, the stories rolled in like thunder. One neighbor had his kid swing set flagged for being too brightly colored. Another had to remove a bird bath because it wasn't in harmony with the landscape. One couple even got fined for leaving their Christmas lights up 3 days past the approved removal date. It was ridiculous, but now it wasn't just funny. It was fuel. Then came the flyers. Sometime around Thursday morning, every single house in the HOA zone found a folded paper in their mailbox. No postage, just hand-delivered. It had the HOA's official letterhead, all fancy and formal, and at the top it read, "Urgent Community Update." They were calling an emergency meeting, mandatory attendance. No specifics given, just a date, a time, and a warning that failure to attend could reflect poorly on future property considerations. It was a scare tactic, a last-minute move to regain control. But nobody was scared anymore. By the time the meeting rolled around Saturday afternoon, the community center parking lot was already packed. People arrived early, not because they were worried, but because they wanted to be there. They brought their lawn chairs, their dogs, even coolers. It looked more like a tailgate than a formal HOA event. Someone brought a speaker and played country music out the back of their truck. Kids ran in the grass. And not a single board member had arrived yet. When they finally showed up late, of course, it was like they were walking into the lion's den. Not a single person clapped. No fake smiles this time. Just rows of folding chairs and firm stares. The board president, a man named Leonard, took the podium. Clean suit, slick back hair, and a voice that sounded like it had never been used to say sorry in his life. He started with the usual scripted nonsense. We're here today because we value our community, and there's been some confusion lately regarding our enforcement actions. And my personal favorite, the HOA is here to protect your property values. But before he could finish, someone stood up. It was Joanne. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. She just held up a petition and said, "We have enough signatures to call for a vote of no confidence, and we want it now." A murmur went through the crowd, like a wave rolling over gravel. Leonard's face twitched. He tried to push back, citing bylaws and clauses, but Joanne had a copy of those too, highlighted, tabbed, and bookmarked. One by one, people stood up, not yelling, just standing, silent, in numbers. It was more powerful than any protest I'd ever seen. Eventually, Leonard's voice cracked. He fumbled his notes and stepped back, muttering something about needing time to consult legal counsel. But it didn't matter. The message had already been delivered. We weren't asking anymore. As the board members packed up and shuffled out, the crowd didn't boo or heckle. They just watched, calm, collected, ready for what came next. I looked across the lot and caught eyes with Tom, standing tall next to his rebuilt mailbox, arms crossed. Maggie gave me a nod from her seat under the oak tree, her cafe apron still tied around her waist. Even the folks who had stayed silent for years were there, watching history quietly rewrite itself, one neighbor at a time. And when I got back home that evening, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting a golden glow on the ranch. I passed by the mailbox, still standing strong, still untouched. But this time, it didn't just feel like mine. It felt like ours. The following week felt like something out of a Western standoff, but instead of guns, it was clipboards, community codes, and a whole lot of side-eye. The board hadn't officially resigned yet, but they'd gone silent. Completely. No calls, no patrols, no letters stuffed into mailboxes with bold red print and fake legal warnings. It was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm or the moment a bully backs off just long enough to plan something sneaky. But nobody was backing down. That Monday, a small group of us, me, Joanne, Tom, and Maggie, decided to do something we never thought we'd have to. We knocked on every door in the neighborhood, not to protest, not to start drama, just to talk, to listen, to make sure every person here knew that change wasn't just possible, it was already happening, one neighbor at a time. It was eye-opening. Some folks have been putting up with the HOA's nonsense for over a decade. One elderly couple said they've been fined 3 separate times for their vines growing too freely over their fence. Another man, quiet ex-military, tough as nails, admitted he'd been threatened with legal action for parking his own trailer on his own land for a single night. These weren't just small annoyances. These were little invasions of dignity, repeated over and over until people felt powerless. That power was finally crumbling. By Wednesday, Joan had finalized the paperwork to force a vote to remove the board entirely. It would be open, transparent, and by the rules, ironically, the very same rules the board used to cling to like a badge of honor. Only now, those rules weren't working in their favor. The petition had grown to over 60 signatures, and with every name added, confidence spread like wildfire. But just when we thought they'd stay quiet, the board made one last move. On Thursday morning, my neighbor Marlene, who lives at the corner lot with the white shutters and the giant sunflower flag, came running down the road. She had a piece of paper in her hand, shaking with frustration. "They posted it on my door," she said, handing it over. It was a cease and desist letter from the board, claiming that any unauthorized neighborhood gatherings, meetings, or canvassing were now in violation of HOA policy. They accused us of fomenting dissent and disrupting community harmony. It was laughable, honestly. We weren't disrupting anything. We were restoring it. We scanned the letter and shared it with everyone. Within hours, the whole road was buzzing. People walked straight to the board office, some with their own letters in hand, others just demanding answers. But the door was locked, blinds closed, nobody home. That same night, a group of us gathered at the fire pit behind Tom's barn. The air was warm, smoke rising slow and lazy through the stars, and voices rose with it. Laughter, stories, even a few songs from Maggie's husband, who used to play in a country band back in the day. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't defiant. It was community, the kind we'd been missing for too long. I looked around that circle, seeing faces that used to nod politely and disappear behind closed doors. Now, they were leaning in, asking questions, offering help. People brought pies, grilled hot dogs, shared old stories about when the neighborhood first started, before it got strangled by rules written in cold ink by people who didn't even live here. And right then it hit me. This wasn't about a mailbox. It never was. It was about people remembering what it feels like to own their space, not just legally, but emotionally. To feel like your land, your home, your time belongs to you, not to some committee in khakis with an agenda. The war had started with tire tracks in the dirt and a busted mailbox post, but it was ending around a fire with neighbors holding marshmallows and passing thermoses of sweet tea. Funny how things turn, not with explosions or lawsuits or screaming matches, but with quiet resolve, shared glances, open doors, stronger fences, not to keep people out, but to keep what matters in. And as the fire cracked and stars wheeled overhead, someone passed me a piece of paper. It was a draft of the new community charter, the one we'd write together. Simple rules, clear boundaries, fair say for every person with a stake in this land. No tricks, no traps, just respect. And suddenly, it all felt possible.